I just couldn't cut down his story because it was just incredibly fascinating and just kept going and going. And his story was interesting because they had to cross a border and his father made him dress like a girl. And he said, I didn't want to dress like a girl. In our country, girls are second class, and I was horrified, but his father knew that the militia was hunting young men to kill. And if he was dressed as a woman, he'd actually would be more protected.
You're listening to Across Archives, a space that highlights storytelling projects, archives, and oral histories that share the experiences of migrants, immigrants, internally displaced people, and refugees around the world. Here, we explore a wider community of storytellers, archivists, advocates, and scholars whose work inspires our own at the Refugee Archive. Together, these efforts bridge divides, build solidarity, and reshape how the record of displacement is remembered.
I am Kristi with Across Archives, and I'm joined by Heather Oman, the Associate Director at Their Story is Our Story. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Great. So, as the Associate Director, can you start us off by just telling us how you got started in this business and what drew you to Their Story is Our Story and what you do every day?
I was friends with one of our founders, Melissa Dalton Bradford, and she and I had worked together on some other writing projects over the years. So we didn't know each other really, really well, but we had experience with other projects together. So I knew what she was doing. She was posting about her work with refugees. She was living in Germany at the time during the Syrian refugee crisis, and she was going into the refugee camps in Germany and teaching the Syrian refugees German. She felt very strongly about sharing the stories of these families that she was working with. And one of the things that we talk about at TSOS is that once you sit knee to knee with somebody and they tell you the story, that's when you really start to understand somebody. And that's when you really see the humanity. And so, Melissa, I was watching all of this stuff that Melissa was doing. She was posting all of her stories online and sort of watching this organization start from the very beginning. I wasn't involved in it at all. I donated some stuff when she sent out calls for donations, but it wasn't until I was approached by someone on TSOS to come in as a writer. Melissa had known me from writing projects in the past. Also, coincidentally, my sister-in-law had come onto the team. And so she said, oh yeah, Heather can come in and do writing. And so they asked me to come in as a writer for stories. And I was told I would be doing, 3 hours a month, 5 hours a month, something like that, something very, very minimal. And we all know that if you walk through the door into refugee work and you think you're going to walk in doing something minimal quickly, it's going to snowball into something much more than that. And that's how it happened at TSOS for me. I walked through the door not knowing very much about refugees at all, coming in with a writing background, and then being caught up in it bit by bit, took on more responsibility at the organization, worked on the story production side of things. Now here I am, 6 years later. And it's been amazing. It's an incredible journey, and refugee work is an incredible place to be.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's first talk about where you work, what kind of region you collect stories in, and take us through mapping out your footprint. What shapes you?
Yeah. TSOS doesn't work in one specific region. We gather stories from anybody who wants to tell their story. And what we try to do is we gather the story from somebody who we define as a refugee or a displaced person. We have decided to, as an organization, to focus on that aspect of storytelling for specifically somebody that we could say is a refugee or, like I said, a displaced person. And the other thing that sort of defines TSOS is that we want to tell the story as a first person narrative presented in the way that they want to present themselves. Oftentimes, people who are refugees or displaced persons, they have to tell their story a certain way to gain asylum. They have to tell their story a certain way to get something. They're told to put in this detail or that detail. They don't always get to represent themselves in the way they want the world to know them. And at TSOS, we want people to be able to have that experience of representing themselves in the way that they want the world to see them. In terms of where we work, we have stories from all over the world. We started in Germany, and TSOS took a story gathering trip over to Greece. There was a storytelling trip over to Bangladesh to work with the Rohingya and Cox's Bazar. And we've had storytelling trips over to Ukraine. We had community programs in Switzerland, and got some stories from Jordan. So, really, we've been kind of all over. At this point, just with the state of things now, our storytelling mostly is happening with refugees who have settled in America. We were going to do some storytelling from Canada. That's still in the works. But for now, our storytelling trips stay in the United States. We took a storytelling trip to Kansas City and gathered stories there. We took a story gathering trip to Bowling Green, Kentucky, and gathered some stories there. We're learning that we don't have to leave the United States to get these stories. There are rich communities here that also need their story told.
And that's interesting because I was talking to someone recently and we were saying there's a debate about what label is placed on migrants, immigrants, or refugees or asylum seekers from a US perspective. Are we calling them refugees? People who have come here from conflict, who've been accepted into this country?
I think you can call them refugees. Certainly, legally, all of those terms that you just used are very legally distinct. An asylum seeker, a refugee, a migrant, economic migrant, all of those have different legal definitions. Something that we're working on is try to get the information out about how there's so many different definitions of an immigrant. There's so many different, I guess, really the better word would be classifications. So, yeah, legally, you can be a refugee. A refugee is somebody who has been vetted already, not deemed a threat to the United States, and then they come here. So, yeah, I think we can call them refugees. Now, are they defined by their displacement? No. And are they so much more than just somebody who has lost everything and has to restart? Yes, of course. And we did a story with some gentlemen from Africa. I can't recall exactly off the top of my head which country they came from, but they very much wanted to say, we are refugees in this country. We have this different classification here in this country, but that's not who we are. Once the conflict resolves, we're going to go back and be the people we were then. So, yes, people are refugees and legally defined as such, but that's not just who they are. There's so much more than just that.
Do you think there's a difference now that you've shifted a bit, given the climate of everything, to refugees who have resettled in the US? Do you feel there's any kind of a difference when you go into their country and their space versus interviewing them here in this new context?
That's a good question. I think there's a different level of uncertainty when somebody is unsettled. If you're going into a refugee camp, there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of waiting, there's a lot of fear. And again, just the waiting, right? We've told stories of people who just spend years and years and years in refugee camps, and their futures are very uncertain. I think when you interview somebody who already is been resettled, yes, there is still some uncertainty to their future, but the future is open. The future is bright. They know that there are steps they can take to get an education or a job, steps to work towards getting a house. We have a lot of people who say, my dream is to own my own house. There's just more certainty when you've already been resettled. One of those questions has already been answered. Where am I going to end up? This is where you are.
That's really interesting. Now, are any particular cultures or people that you've met from countries that you had never met before and learned anything new about traditions or?
Working for TSOS, I learn something new all the time. We tell a lot of stories from Afghanistan, definitely since the fall to the Taliban. What was so interesting about telling those stories from Afghanistan is that everybody had a little bit of the same story. They had to rush to the airport. And we knew that the airport was a chaotic place. We saw that in the United States, watching it on television. We saw these terrible images of people on planes. But it was fascinating to hear everybody's different perspective of how they got through that airport. And just, one woman, her family was rushed through a door because they had some special permit. She said that people just rushed behind them because they were so desperate. Oh, there's an open door. I'm going to go through that open door. Talking about this river that was running through the airport, this river of mud. It was fascinating to see everybody's different perspective on this one moment in time. So that's something that was very fascinating. But we told a story of a man from Darfur, which I had never been to Darfur, didn't really know very much about it. And his story was quite long. Usually we try to keep our stories between 1,500 words to 2,000 words, just because that's kind of a readable, bite-sized amount on a website. But I just couldn't cut down his story because it was just incredibly fascinating and just kept going and going. And his story was interesting because they had to cross a border and his father made him dress like a girl. And he said, I didn't want to dress like a girl. In our country, girls are second class. And I was horrified. But his father knew that the militia was hunting young men to kill. And if he was dressed as a woman, he'd actually would be more protected. So that was an incredibly eye-opening story, too. And we talk about the Rohingya a lot. We had a storytelling trip to Bangladesh to work with the Rohingya. I had never heard of the Rohingya before working with TSOS, and yet they are considered one of the most persecuted minorities in the world. To be able to tell that story, to bring these stories that people aren't familiar with, is one of the great joys of TSOS, to bring these stories to light and to share them. Stories that people probably wouldn't necessarily know about. Certainly that I had never known about.
Yeah, I would love to hear the one from Darfur. Is that on the website now?
It is. He was in a refugee camp and eventually got resettled. And he was actually able to go back to his refugee camp as an aid worker 20 years later. Full circle.
I would love to read that then. Great. I'm going to look that up later. In the Rohingyans, when you were working there, what was the demographic you were focusing on?
We did a couple of different things, but mostly women. Yeah. If you look at our website, we have a whole feature on actually the midwives of the Cox's Bazar, people being trained. Healthcare in a refugee camp, healthcare in general for refugees is pretty dicey. And so there's this amazing program, or there was, we haven't been able to go back and update a lot of our stuff. But at the time, I think this was like 2016, 2017, there was this program for midwives for training to help with the maternal mortality rate.
And so you went there as a team. How do you even get into a camp like that?
Wasn't part of that, but I know that if you make connections with people down there or go with another group, I don't know exactly the logistics of what took us.
That's a really great experience. That's amazing. Such rich context.
Yeah, I wish we could go back and do an update. And we are working on a feature right now where somebody did go into the camp and sent us some video and pictures of it. I said, oh, yeah, we haven't been there since 2017, 2016. And he said, oh, yeah, it's twice as big now.
What do they have? 1.2 million now?
I know, it's up there. Yeah. You showed us video of the school in the camp. There's a hospital in the camp. You think about the logistics of what happens in a refugee camp when people stay there long enough, it stops being a temporary place and starts to have some permanent aspects to it, like a school, a hospital.
That's right. It reminds me of other places in the world that are kind of just corralled into
Right.
a place and no one's sure what's going to happen because they're considered stateless, even though technically they're in Bangladesh. They're
Right.
considered stateless. It's an interesting situation.
Yes. Without a passport, where do you go? That speaks to the uncertainty of living in a camp versus if you've already been resettled. Yes.
And kind of along those lines, how you work in different places, let's shift a little bit to the nuts and bolts of consent and safety in work clothes. You probably have some set operation standards for how you do things, but maybe that shifts across countries and cultures. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So because we are using a public forum, we do have a fairly robust consent process that has emerged out of some problems we had in the early days. People not understanding what their stories were being used for, people thinking that we were profiting off of their stories, people thinking that we were going to take their stories to the American government and say, hey, this person needs to come. So there was a lot of unfortunate misunderstanding in the beginning. And also people saying, I'm not safe. You can't put my picture up there, or you can't put my location up there. So, like I said, we've developed a pretty robust consent procedure before people get interviewed, or definitely before they have anything published. They go through consents that we give them. We have them translated in several different languages so that they can understand them. Then we do the interview. And ideally, anytime we write a story, we have enough contact with the person that we interviewed that we can go back to them and they can have final consent saying, hey, we're going to post this on our website. Is there anything you want to change? Is there any problems that you see? We also have fairly robust consent procedures in place in terms of artwork and pictures. And if you go on the website, you'll see that sometimes we just will have an illustration. Sometimes we will just have an object for our story right in a picture. People will say, no, you can't use my picture. You can't use any kind of identifying features at all. Oftentimes we use aliases, things like that. And that's all written down in the consent. And they'll tell us, yes, you can use my face, you can use the back of my head, an artist rendering, or no, I don't want anything. In that case, we have to go to some kind of illustration or different kind of artwork to go with the story. We've also had people come back and say, they revoke their consent. They say, no, you have to take my story off. And of course we do immediately. Or they'll say, I want my name changed. I want to use an alias. We've had people come back and say, nope, I'm ready to use my regular name. I want to be an advocate. I want to be active. I want people to know who I am. So it can be a fluid situation in terms of what the person that we interview wants and what they're most comfortable with. And of course, always we're thinking about their safety.
Most recently, I was looking into some of the new data policies that these archival groups were putting into place, and some of the conversations they're having about once something has been posted online, even if you remove it, it may be harder to search, or it may be maybe you can't search it, but there's now so many AI web crawlers and AI bots out there that they're like literally capturing and taking all of the information off the internet. So you almost cannot ever scrub it completely. And there's always a chance that it may reappear somewhere.
Mhm.
Are you talking to people about this? And also, there's a new thing that has come up with this AI. People's personal information is ending up in these AI chats, chat
Mhm.
GPT, things like that. It's kind of a new field in
It is.
data security.
We haven't discussed the AI issues and the ethics around AI. So that's a really good point that you bring up. That you're right.
Yeah.
It is pretty impossible to keep it scrubbed all together. So all the more reason why we should have aliases and not put in any sort of revealing information in what we publish. Certainly anything that goes into the archive, all of that is aliased.
Okay. And when you say the archive, do you mean the partnership you have with Brigham Young University?
Yes.
When it goes to Brigham Young University, it's all aliases?
Under an alias.
Oh, wow. Okay. So the researcher could come along and research through your materials, but they wouldn't actually find the name of the person who's been interviewed.
Yeah.
Okay. Wow. Wow. And that's something you have to do before you send them the information? Got
Yes.
it.
That we
So it's
do.
like an extra task to mask things,
Yes.
right? So you scrub them, but not all of them have aliases.
Yeah, we will have to check with Robin. I thought all of them got aliased before they got put into the archive. But we'll check
But
with
it is kind of a new landscape, and most people are not sure what to do. They haven't had the full conversations yet because they don't have enough information to know how to continue to keep people's information safe, especially vulnerable populations. With all of these new technologies that are coming out, it's almost happening so quickly that everyone's trying to think of what to do, but not sure yet. So tell me, what's next for you guys on the list? What are you working on?
a great question. We're continuing to do our interviews. Again, we still have people reaching out wanting to tell their story, and we always love that. We're continuing several collaborations. One of the things that we are also doing is making our interview training more available. So we have put together a training about how to do sort of ethical and trauma-informed training or trauma-informed interviewing, excuse me. And so we have a lot of interest in people wanting that training so that when they do some interview, they do it in a way that is trauma-informed.
Who are the people who want to do interviews? Are they other groups or are they partners in other places that are giving those interviews to you?
So there are other groups, there are other partners. Specifically, we've worked with Georgetown School of Medicine. We're going to be doing a training with George Washington. So anybody who wants to do any kind of interviewing, we're happy to provide this training for them.
That's awesome. So that's on the forefront of what you're doing now.
It's one of the things, yeah, working and making sure that when people do interviews with someone who has been through something very traumatic, that they are interviewed in a way that is not re-traumatizing to them. That's something very important to us as we work with so many vulnerable populations, people who have been through these big traumas, these big changes in their lives. We want to make sure that what we're doing is ethical and that we are not re-traumatizing in the process of gaining their story.
And from a storytelling perspective, what are you working on now? What stories are you collecting now?
Most recently, we have some stories with some young women from Afghanistan, again, who want to share their stories and in a way that works for empowering women who are coming from Afghanistan, empowering them as they're transitioning into the United States.
What do you want people to know about their story is our story? And how can they get involved, support the movement?
We are always looking for volunteers. We would love people who have any kind of writing experience, any kind of social media experience. We are always looking for people to jump in on that end. What would I like people to know about TSOS? No, one of the things that I think about in today's political climate is how do I change people's minds? Or how do I make people see the world in a slightly different way? It's incredibly difficult to make people adjust their beliefs and the way they think. And one of the things that we know changes how people view things is storytelling. When somebody is sitting knee to knee with a refugee or somebody who is different than they are, it's impossible not to feel something for that person. A softening, at the very least, a softening towards somebody. I don't want to say that you're always going to love somebody that you talk to, but you can't help but feel some compassion, feel the slightest connection. And that's what we're trying to do at TSOS, right? We are trying to make everybody know that people are worth connecting with, show that everybody has a story, even if you haven't been through some big trauma. Everybody has a story, right? And when you hear somebody's story, you are automatically connected to them. So at TSOS, we're trying to build connections in a powerful and productive way so that we can make people feel like the world is just one family, right? It's not us versus them ever. It's just us. We're building connections and we are all connected. We talk about Trevor Noah's quote that a refugee isn't something that you are, it's something that happens to you. Anybody could be a refugee, right? It's something that could happen to anybody. And so we want people to recognize that, like I said, we're all connected. And that's what we're trying to build at TSOS.
Yeah, that's good. I think that's so important is the storytelling instead of just reading an article about a group and they're labeled by their country, their ethnicity, or a number of so many. You really get to know them and figure out that they have value and they have talents and skills and ideas, and they're people that would be really beneficial to your neighborhood, your school, your church, your hospital. And
And
so that's important.
we've talked about how much I've learned from TSOS. I think there's so much fear that comes from the unknown. right? Or fear that comes from something that's really different. You look at another culture or you look at somebody who is different than you are, and there's a little bit of hesitancy there. There's a little bit of a barrier. And what we're trying to do at TSOS is to break down those barriers, to say that even if something is unknown or different, or you're not familiar with this culture, language, or you're not familiar with this part of the world, it doesn't matter because, right, we're still all telling the same things. We're still all experiencing the same things.
Yep, very true. Well, I certainly appreciate the work you're doing because I am very passionate about refugee storytelling as well. Together as a collective, I think it's so important that we have thousands of people like us out there trying to disseminate these type of stories so that just gets infused into communities for more global understanding of each other. Thank you so much for joining today. And I can't wait to listen to this story on Darfur later or read it.
Yes, it's a good one. It's a good one. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Across Archives, a project by the Refugee Archive. Our conversations here highlight the storytellers, archivists, and advocates who are shaping how migration and displacement are remembered. If you'd like to go deeper and hear the voices of women living these experiences firsthand, join us on The Archive Speaks, our oral history audio archive, featuring powerful stories from female-headed households and single mothers in displacement around the world. Together, Across Archives and The Archive Speaks preserve memory, amplify unheard voices, and reshape how we understand the experience of displacement. Listen to The Archive Speaks wherever you get your podcasts, or visit the Refugee Archive to explore both projects and learn more about our work.